Energy moves the world, making our work easier, our relationships more meaningful, our lives brighter and more beautiful. Energy has become a natural part of our daily lives that we forget. Not everyone has power to move their lives. 13 million Filipinos presently live in darkness. The Philippines still has one of the lowest electrification rates in Southeast Asia, yet the highest in electricity cost. All of these can change. Imagine a Philippines where every family has affordable and clean energy, where nature is kept for future generations to enjoy, where economic progress is possible for everyone. You can help make this a reality. The Ateneo School of Government presents its newest elective track under the Master in Public Management, Energy Transitions. Advance energy markets by influencing policies and grasping regulations. Safeguard communities through disaster preparations and accelerated restorations. Create energy solutions that make a brighter tomorrow possible for those who need it the most. Be part of the Ateneo School of Government and share in its mission to build the nation, where professionals become distinctive leaders who are ethical, excellent, and innovative.
Enroll in the Master in Public Management and become a graduate of the pioneering Energy Transitions track.
Discover meaningful leadership in energy policy for a better and brighter Philippines.
Lead with mind, serve with heart. Ateneo School of Government, forming leaders, leading reforms. Energy moves the world, making our work easier, our relationships more meaningful, our lives brighter and more beautiful. Energy has become a natural part of our daily lives that we forget. Not everyone has power to move their lives. 13 million Filipinos presently live in darkness. The Philippines still has one of the lowest electrification rates in Southeast Asia, yet the highest in electricity cost. All of these can change. Imagine a Philippines where every family has affordable and clean energy, where nature is kept for future generations to enjoy, where economic progress is possible for everyone. You can help make this a reality. The Ateneo School of Government presents its newest elective track under the Master in Public Management, Energy Transitions. Advance energy markets by influencing policies and grasping regulations. Safeguard communities through disaster preparations and accelerated restorations. Create energy solutions that make a brighter tomorrow possible for those who need it the most. Be part of the Ateneo School of Government and share in its mission to build the nation, where professionals become distinctive leaders who are ethical, excellent, and innovative.
Enroll in the Master in Public Management and become a graduate of the pioneering Energy Transitions track.
Discover meaningful leadership in energy policy for a better and brighter Philippines.
Lead with mind, serve with heart. Ateneo School of Government, forming leaders, leading reforms.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Energy Policy Series, or EPS, a public virtual webinar series that feature the research and policy collaboration produced by Luzon Clean Energy Living Laboratories roster of research fellows in the areas of energy access, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. Luzon Cell is one of the key pillars of the Access to Sustainable Energy Program, Clean Energy Living Laboratories, or ASIP Cells. ASIP Cells is funded by the European Union and implemented by the Ateneo School of Government. And for today's energy policy series, we are delighted to discuss the working paper titled Residential Electricity Consumption over the Demographic Transition in the Philippines. The working paper is already available online at ASOG's website, and you may access it through the link in the chat box that I just shared. Allow me to introduce our distinguished panel for today's energy policy series. We begin with the authors of the paper. First, we have Dr. Michael R.M. Abrigo. Dr. Abrigo is a senior research fellow at the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, where he examines the welfare implications of population dynamics and health policies, among others. He's also a senior research fellow here at the Luzon Clean Energy Living Laboratories at the Ateneo de Manila University School of Government. He has published numerous academic papers in journals such as Tata Journal, Public Finance Review, National Tax Journal, Lancet, and Nature. He obtained his master's and PhD in economics from the University of Hawaii and his BA, magna cum laude, and Master of Statistics degrees from the University of the Philippines. In presenting the paper, Dr. Abrigo will be joined by Maria Kristina P. Ortiz. Ms. Ortiz is a supervising research specialist at the Philippine Institute for Development Studies. She holds a bachelor's degree in economics, minor in public administration from the University of the Philippines School of Economics, and a master's degree in statistics from the University of the Philippines. She also obtained her second master's degree in 2020 in public policy from the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo, Japan. She works on different research areas such as regulation analysis, regulatory impact assessment, reducing unnecessary regulatory burdens, logistics and infrastructure, ASEAN integration, as well as education policy research related to the K-12 program and the free tuition policy. To give his views on the findings of the featured working paper for today's energy policy series, we have our reactor, Dr. Carl Handok. Dr. Handok is an assistant professor at the University of the Philippines School of Economics. He finished his PhD in economics from the University of Hawaii, and his field of interests include theoretical and applied microeconomics, resource, environmental, and energy economics. Dr. Handok has published in both theoretical and applied economics in international journals, such as the International Journal of Game Theory, Games, Journal of Asia Pacific Economy, Philippine Political Science Journal, and the Journal of Child and Adolescent Substance Abuse. And finally, completing the panel for today's energy policy series, we have our moderator, Dr. Laarni Escresa. Dr. Escresa is also our very own senior research fellow at the ASIP Cells and assistant professor at the UP School of Economics. Prior to joining the University of the Philippines, she was a research fellow at the European University Institute, University of Hamburg, and Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies. A few housekeeping rules before we officially begin. Please note that the webinar is also being streamed simultaneously via Facebook Live. And again, for everyone's reference, please access the working paper of today's webinar through the link that I just sent in the chat box. And let me just remind that all participants are under mute during the entire plenary session to ensure a smooth discussion and avoid any technical difficulties. All participants are also encouraged to start sending questions or comments during or after the presentation of Dr. Abrigo and Ms. Ortiz using the Q&A function at the bottom. After the webinar, we will direct you all to a post-event survey to get your feedback and suggestions. And lastly, for those who are keen to obtain a certificate of attendance, an electronic certificate of attendance from today's Energy Policy Series, please remain engaged for at least an hour and accomplish the post-event survey form. The e-certificates will be sent a week after the event. We would like to remind our speakers and reactor to keep your presentation within the agreed ample time so we have adequate time for discussions. And so without much further ado, Dr. Abrigo and Ms. Ortiz, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Let's just wait for Ms. Ortiz to flash the screen. Thank you so much, Tina. So, well, nung sisimulan namin itong study nito, we were interested on how residential electricity changes over the life cycle, and it has transformed into what it is right now, into looking at how residential electricity consumption would change over the demographic transition. And essentially, our question is simple. Next slide, please. Our question is simple. How does demographic change affect aggregate residential electricity demand? And when we look at the stylized facts, next slide, we know that from various studies and from our experience, kayo din, na consumption patterns change in systematic ways over the life course. So pag bata tayo, maliliit yung kinakain natin, mga gatas, yung electricity din na natin, hindi naman tayo masyadong gumagamit ng kuryente, kung ano yung binibigay sa atin. And eventually, magiging tayong bata, nanonood tayo ng cartoons, and then papasok tayo sa school, gagamit tayo ng computer, laptops, ilaw, hanggang pagtanda natin, mas marami na yung ginagamit, and eventually, magtatrabaho tayo, and then we would retire. And then we would have the amenities that we want for ourselves. And for so long, no one is really looking at life stages in the electricity consumption. Hindi siya masyadong usong pag-usapan until recently. And we found out, based on previous studies, that elderly consume more energy per capita compared with other age groups. And this may be related to differences in housing amenities. So yung mga matatanda, usually nakapag-ipon na sila, so they own more household assets, meron silang TV, ref, so on, that they have accumulated through their lifetime. Pwedeng iba rin yung living arrangements. So usually yung elder lives with other elderly or other adults. So mas konti sila. Another is that they have yung mga amenities na ginagamit nila in more industrialized countries, sa mga malalamig na bansa, they have heating. So at mas gusto nila na mas warm based on studies, kaya mas mataas yung electricity consumption nila. And another is differences in tastes in technology. Pwede kasing namili sila ng TV 10-20 years ago, or even refrigerator na hindi pa nila pinapalitan, or they might have preference over this is especially true in developed countries. Baka meron silang preference over types of heating compared to others. So these are some reasons why the literature says na mas mataas yung consumption ng elderly compared with other age groups. And with this idea, in an aging population, you would expect na kung mas marami yung elderly, mas marami matatanda who are consuming more compared to other age groups, then you would expect that aggregate demand would increase. And this is true in a static partial equilibrium framework. But there are studies in a general equilibrium framework that incorporates ano ba yung mga feedback mechanisms sa prices, employment ng aging population, and they found out that income and price effects may actually dampen the increase in electricity demand. So hindi siya talaga straight up na increase, pwede rin siyang bumaba because of population aging. So we try to address this in the case of the Philippines using a different model. Next slide. So in this study, we try to assess the contribution of demographic change on aggregate household electricity demand over our own demographic transition. So we employ an index decomposition analysis that I would discuss later to trace ano ba yung mechanisms how this demographic change may affect the demand for electricity. And we link this index decomposition analysis with an economic demographic model to project ano ba yung likely path na nitong demand natin for residential electricity over our demographic transition. Here we are projecting until 2050, and ito yung pinaka-summary ng ating result is that we find that population aging has a direct, significant, and persistent effect on residential electricity demand, which we would discuss later. Next slide, please. So you may know this, but this is not really, this is not news, but many people do not know this. The Philippines is young, but we are actually aging. Sa dami ng bata sa Pilipinas, we are actually close to aging. Next slide, please. So over the last 50 years, there's a dramatic decline in fertility rate in the Philippines. In the 1970s, an average woman would expect to have about 6 children over her lifetime. More recently, less than 3 na lang yung ina-expect ng average woman. And this is an important contribution in population aging. Pag bumaba yung fertility rate mo, you would expect that eventually, after a few generations, na you would have a bulge of group of people, a cohort that would drive the aging process. So by 2030s, based on projections by PSA and UN, they project that by 2030s, at least 7% of the elderly age 65 plus, around 7% of the population would be elderly, and that makes us an aging population. Plus another generation, just another generation by 2060s, we will transition into an aged population with at least 14% elderly. And because of this demographic transition, there have been studies around the world and on the Philippines showing that this demographic change actually contributed significantly to our welfare. So based on a study by Mason in 2016, they estimated that about our per capita income increased by 1.4 percentage points because of this demographic transition, 1.4% percentage point per year. So that's quite a lot. Next slide. We know from data that household electricity consumption is increasing, and this is next slide. This table is from the Department of Energy in 2016. So if you look at total electricity consumption, so in 2000 about 45 terawatt hours, until 2015 82. Okay, and here we're showing you consumption by sector and generation by source. So year on year, it's increasing by 4.1% on average. Next slide. And there's a slight shift from industrial to commercial use, but essentially yung distribution niya, residential, commercial, industrial, and others, fairly stable siya over 2000 and 2015. And finally, when we look at the generation by source, we are still reliant on non-renewable sources, and the growth in the electricity generation over the last since 2000 is mainly through the non-renewable sector, because yung ating renewables have stagnated at around 20 terawatt hours per year. Okay, next slide. So when we focus at residential electricity consumption, there is an increase in both aggregate and per capita consumption between 2000 and 2015, which is our study period. And these change coincided with important changes in different factors. Here we listed ano ba yung mga approximate measures of aggregate demand. So one, you would look at population. Pag dumadami yung population mo, mas maraming gumagamit ng kuryente, you would expect na tataas din yung aggregate residential electricity demand. And that is what you observe. Tumataas din yung electrification rate natin. Ano yung proportion of households who have access to electricity, who are actually connected to may kuryente. And over the last, since 2000, tumaas siya from about 75% to 89% in 2015. Prices has also been increasing. So standard theory, economic theory would say na it would dampen yung demand. And then over this period also, we've seen yung income ng mga households increasing. And here we proxied it by GDP per capita, which has been increasing for over the last so many years. Next slide, please. Another important aspect na nakita natin is that per capita electricity consumption by age has also been increasing. This is an estimate that we have for the study. On the x-axis, you have age, and on the y-axis, you have residential electricity consumption per capita. Details of this are available dun sa working paper. And these are some observations that we have. First, there's a visible hump among young adults. So between around 15 to 30, you would see that hump na mas mataas siya on average compared dun sa sunod na 30, around 30-ish na consumption. So siguro to yung mga batang babad sa TV or so on. Second, there's an upward shift in consumption across all age groups. If you compare 2000 and 2015, that would be very obvious na tumaas yung per capita consumption by age over this period. And finally, naging siyang steeper over this 15-year horizon. So in 2015, yung mga elderly, they are consuming about 1.6 times more than those of the same age pero different cohort in 2015. See? Can you see those patterns? Next slide. And these are important implications paano natin on aggregate demand. The next question is, given these changes in these many different factors, how do we tease out ano ba yung contribution ng factors nito? What's the contribution of these factors to aggregate residential electricity demand? Next slide. So the paper is quite technical, but I try to move away from that. Meron lang siguro mga konti na I want to show just to drive the story. So we did an index decomposition analysis. The idea is that our aggregate demand, yung total, is a product of three factors. One is electrification rate, yung gamma T, the size of the population by age, that's NT, and ST. ST would be the share, and the average usage by age, that is yung E. And with some few tricks in mathematics, elementary mathematics, you'd be able to decompose the growth in residential electricity demand as this. So you have, so yung growth natin over a period in aggregate residential electricity demand may be decomposed as these factors. One would be related to access, gaano nagbago yung electrification rate. Another would be related to scale, gaano ka nagbago yung population. And another would be related sa mean intensity, gaano kalaki o bago na nabago yung usage intensity nung mga gumagamit ng kuryente. And within that mean intensity, pwede pa siyang i-breakdown into age-specific intensity. Nagbabago ba yung usage within age groups? So, limbawa, yung matatanda ba, mas marami ba silang kinokonsume per capita over this period? Or pwedeng age structure, paano nagbago yung age structure holding yung per capita consumption fixed? And then there's a small interaction effect which is negligible. And next slide, please. So we did that exercise, and this is the results for 2015 using Philippine data. Next slide. So you have access, scale. Itong tatlong dulo is mean intensity. So essentially, itong annual growth, we're trying to decompose it into these 5 factors. So you can see that from this table, that population size growth is important in aggregate demand growth. And actually, over this 15-year horizon, half the annual growth is because of scale. Dumadami yung population natin. So from 3.9% annual growth between 2015, 1.8 percentage points of that is because yung malaking population natin. Next slide. Another important part is because improving access. So 1.2 percentage point. Next slide. And finally, yung average usage, yung usage intensity actually played only secondary role in aggregate demand growth. Okay, so in total, about 0.8 percentage points compared sa 3.9. So medyo maliit siya. Okay, next slide. Yung effect on population, we would observe that in the age structure effect. And here, it is quite small, 0.3 percentage point. And if you think about it, during this period kasi, hindi pa naman tayo masyadong nag-age. Around 5% pa lang, less than 5% yung ating elderly during this period. Next slide. So, where would we see yung effect ng population change? One would be, syempre, sa age structure change. Nag-shift yung ating population from a young population. Yung mass niya is generally from more children into more elderly, so age structure effect. But there's also this second round effect of demographic change through access and age-specific intensity, which cannot be separated using this historical decomposition. Okay? So sa next slide, what we will do is to tease it out in a model using data from the Philippines. So here, we want to answer how does demographic change would affect residential electricity demand over this demographic transition. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, demographic change would have at least two effects and at least two pathways para maapektuhan niya yung aggregate yung residential demand, electricity demand. One is through an accounting effect, so change in age structure, and an income effect, which would change yung age-specific intensity, gaano kalaki yung ginagamit ng electricity kada age group, and access. And our expectation is that with higher income, you would expect na mas mataas yung age-specific intensity at tataas din yung access. Next slide. So, yung unang pathway, yung accounting effect, madali siya. It's just an accounting effect. So, pwede siyang i-calculate direkta. But how would demographic change affect household income? Okay. Here's where the idea of demographic dividends come in. And you might have heard about demographic dividends. Essentially, it's a potential growth in per capita income or consumption in some cases. Yung ibang authors, they would use consumption because of changes in population age distribution. Dahil nagbago yung distribution ng ating population, we would expect growth in per capita income. And we can see it using a decomposition of per capita income. Here, YT is income, NT would be aggregate income, and NT would be your population. Next slide. And your per capita income growth, which is your demographic dividends, would just be the sum of two dividends. One would be yung increase sa worker per consumer, which we call the support ratio. That is what you call the first demographic dividend. And when people talk about demographic dividend, they're usually talking about the first demographic dividend. Ano yung impact ng changing population distribution? And that's it. It's an accounting effect. But there's also another demographic dividend, which we call the second demographic dividend, which operates through output per worker, sa productivity. How does this come about? So during the demographic transition, yung fertility declines, and with this decline in fertility, mas konting bata kada mga magulang, and the observation is that habang mas kumukonti yung mga bata kada magulang, mas intense yung investments ng mga magulang ng society sa mga bata in terms of higher education, better health investments, which makes them more productive eventually when they go into the labor force. That's one effect. Another way na pwedeng maapektuhan ng demographic change yung productivity is through savings. So sabi natin, with demographic change, eventually population will age. You would expect these people na mag-retire and you would have this bulk. And these people, tayo, eventually mag-retire tayo, and we are foreseeing a long life, we would want to save for that future. And this would raise capital per worker, which would raise output per worker eventually. And this is what we call the second demographic dividend, which is a behavioral effect. So tulad ng sinabi kanina, usually pag sinasabing demographic dividend, they're just talking about the accounting effect of first demographic dividend. But actually, there's also a behavioral effect in these demographic dividends. And we would include both in our analysis. Next slide. So what we did was to calibrate an economic demographic model by Mason. I would not discuss it here, but the details are available in the working paper yung nakalink sa chat box. And we calibrate it using Philippine data to the extent possible, and then we use what's available in the literature. We use 3 UN projections, low, medium, high fertility. Then we estimate ano ba yung ina-expect natin na demographic dividends? Kano ba kalaki? And then with those estimates, we link that with an IDA, yung kanina ko pinakita, to show how demographic transition may affect Philippine residential electricity demand through an income effect. Okay? Next slide, please. So these are the population scenarios that we looked into. So these are based on the UN projections from 2019. So we have low, medium, and high fertility scenarios. Ang baseline natin is 2015. So with the medium fertility scenario, we would expect TFR would be about 1.9 from the current 2 point something. Pag high, 2.4. Pag low, 1.4. And this would be related to future share of the elderly and the young. So, syempre with low fertility, mas mabilis yung aging process. With high, mas mabagal. Okay? And with low fertility, we would expect na mas mabagal din yung increase ng population ng Pilipinas. Next slide. So these are our estimates of the demographic dividends for the Philippines until 2050. Next slide. So this is for the medium fertility scenario. We see that the demographic transition will contribute about more than 1 percentage point increase in per capita income until 2050. So sabi natin kanina, dalawa yung effect ng demographic dividends. One would be the accounting effect, another would be the behavioral effect. So yung blue, that would be the accounting effect, the first demographic dividend, and it is declining. And we will observe this for so long, and it's actually closing by 2050. By 2050, negative na siya. So hindi na siya dividend, ano na siya, magbabayad ka na because you are an aging population. And usually this first demographic dividend is what we call a window of opportunity kasi because of this extra income per capita, people can use it to invest on education and so on and so forth. Okay, much of the growth from the demographic dividend is actually from productivity growth. So meron tayong ina-expect na about 1 percentage point increase in per capita income because of these growth in productivity. Next slide. So we did this for low fertility scenario and high fertility scenario, and the story is similar. Medyo magkaiba lang yung timing. Siyempre, pag low fertility scenario, mas mabilis yung aging process, and you would expect na mas mataas ng konti yung first demographic dividend kasi mas malaki yung wave ng mga workers that would be coming. And then for high fertility scenario, mas mabagal yung mas mabilis naman yung pagwala niya kasi we need that decline in fertility to have this first demographic dividend. But essentially, we would have persistent demographic dividend throughout, but more persistent lang pag low fertility scenario. Next slide. Okay, so these are our estimates. Ano ba, with these demographic dividends and with the change in fertility scenario, how would that affect residential electricity demand in the Philippines? These are our estimates. Similar ito na decomposition as before, but now we are projecting into the future. Here we are just looking at the medium fertility scenario. So sabi natin kanina, yung access will be the change in electrification rate, yung size will be the change in the population, intensity would be the change in per capita usage. Okay? And here, yung access and yung age-specific intensity, these are driven by the demographic dividends. Okay? So based on these estimates, we can see that yung population natin, our demography is projected to have a significant contribution on residential electricity demand. So from 2015 to 2050, more than 1 percentage point until 2050. Pababa siya over the period. Next slide. And these would be mainly from changes in population size, especially sa simula. In the near future, yung population size natin will drive the growth in residential electricity demand. But eventually, it would taper with the rate of the decline depending on the assumed fertility scenario. So kung low fertility scenario, mas mabilis yung decline nung effect ng size. Next slide. Yung changes in per capita electricity consumption, which we call the mean intensity effect, is projected to play only secondary roles in the early part. Eventually, it would dominate over the size and the access effect. Okay, next slide. Yung income effect, this is due from the demographic dividend, is projected to contribute about 0.4 percentage to 0.7 percentage point growth in annual residential demand over this horizon. And this is because of greater electrification rates and because of increased age-specific usage intensity among households. So dahil mas maraming kita yung mga tao, more likely na makaka-access sila ng electricity at mas mataas yung gamit nila per person. Next slide. And as expected, pinakita natin kanina, yung demographic dividend will decline through time. And we would observe that also with the income effects through access and the age-specific intensity effects. Next slide, please. So we did a sensitivity analysis. Yung details nito would be in the ASOG working paper. But essentially, we're trying to find out, magbabago ba yung kwento natin if we change some of the key behavioral parameters in the model. So binago natin yung technology, binago natin yung capital output growth rates, mas mabilis ba yung capital mag-grow kaysa output, even the output elasticities, and fairly robust yung ating results na hindi masyado nagbabago. We still find that significant contribution of population change on residential electricity demand. Next slide, please. Okay. So far, yung kwentuhan natin, wala pang sinasabi about prices. And we know from theory na price is a salient factor sa demand for electricity. Although in the Philippines, there are studies showing na fairly sticky yung ating demand. Na kahit tumaas ang presyo, hindi masyado nagbabago yung ating demand. We still use electricity. Next slide. So we try to assess ano bang mangyayari. Ang idea is how would price affect our estimates? And we try to turn the question around na instead of answering that question, ang tanong na lang natin, gaano kalaking presyo yung mag-negate ng effect ng demographic change. So gaano kalaking inflation ang kailangan para lahat ng sinabi ko kanina na mga estimates ng effect ng demographic change sa electricity demand would be negated, maging zero. And it turns out, kailangan mo na mataas yung annual inflation rate just to remove those effects from population change. So in 2015, dapat yung annual inflation rate mo would be about 11% hanggang 6% for the medium fertility in 2050, or between, if we look at the low and high fertility scenarios, between 4 and 7% per year inflation rate in electricity prices. Okay, kung cumulate mo yan from 2015 to 2050, by 2050 dapat yung price index natin ng electricity would be about almost 2,000. Diba? Kailangan mo ng malaking presyo para manigate yung effect ng demographic change. Essentially, that's the story. And we think, next slide, that it's not likely to happen. Okay? At least in the near term, based on recent historical energy price data. If we look at our CPI and look at electricity price inflation between 1995 and 2020, yung average is only 3.7% per year. And has gone beyond 8% only in 5 instances over the span of 25 years. So hindi siya mangyari based on history. Also, it may be challenging to maintain high inflation over extended periods. And here's the thought process. When you have high prices, that would signal market profitability, that would entice investments, that would expand future electricity supply, and eventually that would depress prices. So mahirap itaas yung presyo ng electricity if we have a working market. Next slide. And then, I guess, and this is the second to the last slide, ano ngayon? So what, diba? After all this story, why do we care? Well, here, this working paper na to, we've shown that population aging has a direct, significant, and persistent effect on residential electricity demand. And based on studies, we know that population aging is sort of permanent and it's irreversible. It could be reversed, but it's very expensive. So it's sort of irreversible. And because of the persistence of the economic growth from demographic change, this may drive continuing growth in the energy sector. And this has important implications. Una, well, it's not here, especially on planning. Gaano ba karaming planta ang kailangan natin? Just because our population is changing. But more importantly, on prices. Kasi if demand is increasing, but hindi naman sumusunod yung ating supply, then that would drive prices up, and that have implications on welfare. But as I've mentioned earlier, in a working market, you would expect na eventually itong prices would adjust as firms go in and out of the market. So hopefully, the market would expand to be able to accommodate this increase in demand. And then finally, it also has an important implication on the environment. As I've shown earlier, from year 2000, hindi naman masyado nag-expand ang ating renewable energy sector. Okay? And if we expect this so much demand, so much increase in demand, at least in the residential electricity market, at ganun pa rin ating technology, this would have negative implications on our environment through pollution produced by our energy sector. And I guess in a way, this could drive innovation in the energy market na because of this change in demand, increase in demand, change in prices, that it would be rallying cry na we need to have a change in how we do things, that we need to shift to more sustainable forms of energy so that hindi ganun kalaki yung epekto natin in the future just because we have a population that is dynamic, that is changing. And with that, I end my presentation. Maraming pong salamat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abrigo, and also Kristina for such a comprehensive presentation and really drawing in the relationship between the changing demographics and its impact, not just on energy consumption, but also to across all aspects of environment, prices, and welfare. And at this point, we encourage our participants to start sending their questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom. In sending your questions or comments, do not forget to please state your name and affiliation. So moving forward, let's have our reactor for today, Professor JANDOC, to present his views on the working paper. Professor JANDOC, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. First of all, I would like to thank ASEP Cells for inviting me to make comments on Dr. Abrigo's and Tina's paper over here. And just a disclaimer, I've known Mike for close to a decade now. We live together in the same house in Hawaii. And so I know his habits. So I know that he knows his paper because he's young and he doesn't consume electricity that much. Naka-laptop lang siya sa gabi, hindi siya nag-TV and everything. So, and I know that this is a very well thought out study. Now, let me first try to synthesize or provide a synopsis for his study. So, I mean, Mike can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this paper used a decomposition exercise to separate the effects of population electrification rate, population size, and household electricity consumption per capita on aggregate demand growth. I mean, electricity demand growth, and then employed those estimates in a calibration exercise of an economic demographic model to project future increases in residential electricity demand growth. And the authors find that population aging has a significant effect on electricity demand growth, and that dividends from demographic transitions may have an increasing demand impact even beyond aging to a positive income effect. Now, I think this paper is an important attempt in determining the effects of the demographic transition on energy demand in a developing country context. Now, this is important because most of the studies have focused on developed country contexts where aging is more stark, but the issues in aging is more stark, but kudos to the to the authors for thinking about the Philippines and applying um, the concepts in demographic transition to estimate increases in electricity demand. Now, I would say at the outset that the paper is generally well written and methodologically sound, given the known limitations of the data sets they use and the models that they employ. So I will just provide some comments on the paper's technical aspects that hopefully will improve the plausibility or the integrity of its findings. So my first comment is that the differences in electricity consumption between age cohorts may be fundamentally related to the efficiency of the long-lived stock of energy using durable goods, like, for example, washing machines, air conditioners, refrigerators, and the like. So for instance, older households, given their diminished income, may prefer not to adopt more efficient appliances. So it would be good if the paper can add controls for this in their model. For example, proxy more expensive uh, uh, energy efficient units by using unit prices in FIES, for example, the data set that they use. It would be helpful to have a discussion of the effects of such technology-related improvements in efficiency. And this is because younger households are likely to adopt more energy-saving appliances, so this may impact energy consumption over the demographic transition. My second comment relates that while the paper recognizes that electricity prices are not explicitly included in the analysis, maybe it's possible that a similar decomposition may be made over expenditures and not on consumption itself. Okay, so for example, in their equation one, maybe add prices there. So the average price may be proxied by expenditures over kilowatt hours in the FIES data. So therefore, the growth in expenditures can be decomposed over such price changes, holding quantity fixed, and the other components that you have in equation one. My third comment is that while their regression in the paper's appendix A, it is not shown in the slides, but it's there in the discussion paper, that regression in appendix A controls for household characteristics in the form of electricity using amenities and income quintiles to control for the type of appliances that households use and for the household's economic status. But I think it would be beneficial to address the fact that electricity consumption may exhibit economies of scale. For example, larger households or large and older households may need only one set of appliances, say one refrigerator or one air conditioning unit, compared to smaller families. Okay, so smaller families would need one refrigerator, but bigger families only need one refrigerator. So in that sense, there may be some economies of scale present in electricity consumption. And it would be helpful for the paper to explicitly state all the household level controls that they employ, okay, in estimating the equation 8.1 over there. My fourth comment is that in your calibration, you had a number for income elasticity, 0.166, which you calculated in Appendix B using a cross-country regression. But my comment is that how will this estimate change when your sample consists only of developing countries? Because your sample in your paper, consisted of all countries, both developing and developed countries. So it may be possible that the elasticity of electricity consumption to GDP may be nonlinear, and so including developed countries may make the income elasticity lower or higher than usual. Okay. And my last comment is that in your calibration exercise, is it possible to disaggregate it by urbanity? Because, well, at least for the Philippines, older individuals make up a higher proportion of rural population as opposed to urban population. So it would be possible to surmise that an increase in the population of the aging rural areas will not have a much pronounced impact on residential electricity demand. given that household in urban areas consume more because they have all these appliances, etc., etc. Um, so aging in the rural population may not have um, that more pronounced impact compared to aging, say, in the urban population. Okay, so I guess this is the crux of my comment, but during the open forum later, I may ask more questions. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Professor Handok, for those insightful comments. May we ask the authors of the paper, Dr. Abrigo and Ms. Ortiz, to provide a brief response to the comments and views and perspectives raised by Dr. Handok.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much, Carl, for those very insightful comments as usual. Well, really like your comments about changing some of the specifications, like putting in controls for economies of scale. We would include state household characteristics if we use them, and using different income elasticities based on a sample of the developing countries. We really like those comments. But your comments about separating the estimation by urbanity, that is very useful, but I guess not for these exercise, because we're just looking at the main point of the paper is just look at how aggregate demand would change change over the demographic transition. But I fully agree with your comment, and I guess that would be a good follow-up paper about expenditure, looking at expenditure rather than demand. We actually thought about that, but we decided not to do that because uh, when we talk about expenditure, we need to talk about not just the demand, but also the supply side. And we really don't want to go into that detail. Okay, thank you so much. But I really appreciate your comments. Thank you so much.
I think I have to unmute myself. So thank you very much uh, for those comments and also the rejoinder that was made by Dr. Abrigo. I think we are now ready to turn our attention to the open discussion. Again, we remind all participants to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom platform to send in your questions and kindly indicate your name and affiliation. The open forum or the Q&A will be moderated by our senior research fellow here at the Zone Cell, Professor Escresa. Go ahead, Professor Escresa, the floor is yours.
Hello, good afternoon. Good morning. Thank you very much for that very insightful and enlightening presentation and discussion, Mike, Tina, and Carl. So again, we would like to remind our participants in this forum that the Q&A is now open. Right. So we have, I think we have our first question here. First from Hio Tiao Lim. Actually, she has two questions. So our family of five, so I'll just read. Our family of five consumed between 300 to 400 kilowatt hour per month pre-COVID pandemic with full activities at home, work, study, live and play. Our monthly consumption now averages 950 to 1,200 kilowatt hour. We peaked at 1,250 kilowatt hour this month due to hot summer and humidity issues. Can you foresee our pattern in the next years? And there's also another follow-up question. So do you agree that with the introduction of new and advanced technology, e.g. inverters, series of appliances, and LED lighting, would this have an effect on energy usage?
Okay. On the first question about foreseeing your consumption pattern in the next years, unfortunately, I cannot do that. But I can say something about the population as a whole. Na it would continue to increase because of population change, and that's the idea of the paper. But not so related. In another study, we're looking at how electricity consumption has changed over these because of this pandemic, and we actually see that pattern from the commercial industrial, it has somehow shifted to household consumption. So yung dati kasi baka nasa opisina, ngayon nasa bahay magtatrabaho, and somehow that shifted the consumption. And somehow that speaks about there were arguments during the start of this pandemic saying because of this pandemic, actually the environment is healing and so on and so forth because we're consuming electricity, which is actually not true. Nag-shift lang yung marami dun sa consumption.
Oh, okay.
On the next question, do you agree that yung new advanced technology will have an effect on energy usage? Definitely it has an effect, but it may not be the effect that we are expecting. Okay, so you would expect that because of these inverter, mas mas efficient yung usage, so mas konti dapat. But then if you come to think about it, and this has been documented in many studies, na yung price actually, the price that households face because of this inverter technology mas mura. So that raises yung demand. So depende kung ano yung mas salient, yung price effect ba or yung technology. Minsan what we have this notion of a rebound effect na kasi mas efficient na yung ating technology, actually we use more of that technology, so in the end mas marami pala yung ating ginagamit. Okay, so there's an effect, but it may not be the effect that we're expecting.
Okay, thank you very much. But may I follow up also on that question, because I think that is quite interesting. So the role of technology, especially energy efficient, the energy efficient innovation in appliances and residential appliances. So I would like to ask, because we are projecting here 30 years, right, up to 2050. So in between this period, there a lot of uncertainties, including this technological innovation. We don't know what's going to be the next. Also, of course, my reference would be the advanced countries. They are now, I saw on social media, my friends, their parents just bought Tesla cars, so electric cars. So so there's an uncertainty in technology, and I understand also that in the model, these are also taken into consideration with respect to the scenarios of the fertility scenarios and also the sensitivity analysis. So what about this uncertainties? How would they affect? Also, another uncertainty is this surprise, the pandemic, right? So, and also climate change, because if we are projecting up to 2050 and 2030, these are the climate scenarios. There's also a lot of uncertainty with respect to climate scenarios, and of course, this would also impact electricity demand, right? And so I was just wondering, how would this be taken into consideration if, just in case they weren't yet? Maybe I missed something in the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darnie, for that question. Well, the short answer is we didn't take into account those uncertainties because, as we mentioned in the paper, these effects are distinct effects because of population. The other effects because of technology change, climate change, those would be on top of these effects due to the population. Although you can think about second-round effects because of COVID-19, and you would expect a boom in fertility, although we haven't seen that yet based on the data that we have. But if you have that expectation, then that would change our projections also. But those are good points that to also note in the paper.
Yeah. Okay. So there's also, it's a very interesting. So maybe there's another question here from Donna Valdez. What do you think of the effect of the frequent brownouts to the electric
Well, this is beyond the scope of the paper, but this is an interesting question because, well, syempre pag walang kuryente, di wala kang consumption. But if you think about it, if you have to restart your plant every time, then you need to consume energy to warm up the plant and so on. So actually, you would need more energy, given the same duration of electricity that you're producing.
Okay, while waiting for other questions from the audience, so speaking of brownouts, because we all know that these brownouts usually happen in rural areas, especially in some off-grid, what is referred to as the off-grid sector, and also in relation to the demographic shift, because the last time I went to a field work and I saw that in Palawan, some areas that used to unelectrified communities, which are now beginning to be electrified. And you see the huge development, especially along the places that have nice beaches. And these are being marketed as retirement communities. So I think that that would, because you mentioned earlier about the planning, right? Planning of the generation sector. So especially that they are not connected to the main grid, and if this would be, if we would foresee a increase in electricity demand in this off-grid communities driven by this shift in rich haven of retirees, not just Filipinos, also foreigners as well. So maybe that would also be taken into consideration. So I think, so maybe Carl, do you have other, maybe you have other,
Yeah, I was just scribbling some notes before, but I was really interested in during the tail end of your presentation that you need like double-digit inflation in electricity prices to overturn the integrity of your estimates. I was just wondering because prices can hit two ways. First is that when electricity prices increase, the main complaint is that it discourages investments, for example, in manufacturing, and therefore discourages like growth in those sectors, which will lead to lower overall economic growth, which will affect in turn household incomes and therefore the demand, say, for electricity appliances. But there's also a direct effect of prices being high to say households' demand for energy consuming appliances. So that double digit growth that you have, is it more of the first channel affecting income, or is it like does that also include like the direct route of prices effect on households' appetite for buying appliances, for example?
Well, I'm just thinking about the expansion in the supply because of price effects. I was not really thinking about households and their incomes, but that is a nice point. So essentially, what you're saying is that price effects are actually two-sided blades, right?
Yeah.
That affects not just the it entices more investments, but also it dampens production in other sectors. And I guess that's a good point that we should answer in the paper.
Yeah, because double digit, I mean, that would definitely kill the economy. And so therefore it will, I mean, I don't know how many, maybe those are effects beyond the demographic, the demographic variables that you have there. But yeah. Yeah, that's my question for now, Arnie. I'm still, yeah.
So there is also another technical question here. So you simulated 3 scenarios in the study. What do you think is the most likely scenario in the years to come? On a related note, the PSA recently reported that the Philippine population is now at 109 million, though the population growth rate has been slightly reduced. And then another question from Sir Joseph Yap. So he said that he would like to apologize because he has not yet read the paper, but the revised paper, sorry. But were you able to address the question about the possibility of a reverse U-shaped relation between aging and productivity? Okay, a simple yes or no would suffice.
We didn't do it yet in a paper. We haven't revised it yet to answer that. But yes, there's a reverse U shape because we've only projected it between 2015 to 2050. But actually, if we did a longer projection, and that's what the other authors, Mason et al., saw using projections up to 2300. So they saw that reverse U shape. And we observed that for the first demographic dividend, also for the second demographic dividend. Uh, Laurie, can you repeat the first question? I didn't quite get the first question.
Sorry. So the question is that so you simulated 3 scenarios in the study: high, medium, and low fertility. So what do you think is the most likely scenario in the years to come? So that's the main question.
Well, we usually stick with the medium fertility scenario, although uh, it's between low and medium because, well, there are many factors that affect fertility, especially education. And with increasing education, you would expect fertility to decline. And, well, to some extent, we've made some progress, although, well, based on more recent reports, of course, there are some issues. But we're expecting fertility to decline in the future.
Okay. So I think that we we're still waiting. We don't have any new questions from the audience. Sorry about this. From the participants. Yeah. So
I think, Dr. Arnie, if I could ask more of a policy question to add to the discussion. So, for those who are not really experts in econometrics, I think I'd raise the question about what do you think, Dr. Abrigo, will be the implication for the findings of your study with respect to existing frameworks in our country, such as the Philippine Energy Plan, and how will the study contribute in shaping future energy frameworks that will benefit the country, given that in a few months' time or in a year from now, we'll be having a new administration coming in, and given the current uncertainty brought by the pandemic, I think all the discussions about happening in the energy sector would also slightly change given the long-term impact of COVID-19. So to make my question really really short is, what would, if you're going to talk to DOE officials about the key findings of the paper, what would you like them to what would be the message that you want them to take away from the key findings of the paper when they're going to draft any any future energy framework that would advance the country in a more um, adoption of innovative or renewable energy?
Well, the main idea of the paper is that population aging has a direct, significant, and persistent effect on the demand for electricity. And we should not just be thinking about population size as a main driver of demand, but also an aging population. So with an aging population, you would expect that there would be higher usage intensity of electricity, and we should plan for this increase in demand because that has important implication on prices that affects welfare, but also on the environment given the technology that we are using to produce this electricity.
Thank you, Dr. Rico. Yes, Dr. Arnie, back to you.
okay, thank you very much. That's actually a very important question. Thank you very much, Mark, for asking. And also, that's because, as mentioned, it's very important to plan the generation of the country, especially that constructing generation plants take long time, the gestation period. And also, of course, that also has the demo, just to link the presentation by the paper by Mike and Tina with respect to the generation planning, the supply side. So we have to, the implications would be to plan not just the generation, but also the transmission planning, which is very important. And also the generation mix. This is also what I am saying. Sorry, but my bias, I'm because my current research is in the off-grid sector. So I am thinking with respect to the off-grid sector, especially anticipating the impact on the subsidy and also to the off-grid sector, and also its impact on whether or not they should be connected to the main grid, because if this off-grid islands become because as you can see in this in this off-grid islands, the demand is quite heterogeneous too. You have there the poor population, recipients of the 4Ps, but also you have here, you see this the recent development in tourism, right? And so and actually, if you look at the consumption of these off-grid islands, you would see that there is a the highest consumption. So the distribution of the consumption is quite skewed. You have very low, and then on the one hand, you have very high consumption from commercial establishments. But of course, I know that the paper just refers to the residential sector, but you could see that the Airbnbs, for example, are also, I don't know, maybe they're also considered as residential. So I think that it's important, not just important to plan, especially with respect to the to important implications, especially with respect to the off-grid sector and off-grid planning, which is sometimes always sometimes taken for granted, the off-grid sector. So if you have any question, other I'm not getting any our okay, so there is also another question here. How do you project the electricity growth rate from 2021 and 10 years after? In the 90s, we used an elasticity factor of 2 times the GDP growth rate. After the Asian crisis, the elasticity factor is 1:1 factor between GDP and electricity growth rate.
Okay. So it's similar to what you were using. Yes, the elasticity that we use is about around 1, close to 1. But in the paper, what we're trying to do is to trace how the demographic change, not because of GDP, but not because of GDP as a driving force, but because of population change, how demographic change would affect demand for electricity. And we trace that through an accounting effect, because we have more elderly. How would that change the intensity, the usage of electricity per capita, and through an income effect through the demographic dividend. So that would somehow course through the GDP somehow, but then we're just focusing on the impact of the demographic change on electricity use. We want to highlight how population aging, demographic change would affect our future demand.
Thank you very much. So there's not much question. I think part of the reason is because, as mentioned by Carl, the paper is very well thought out, and there's not much questions on technical aspects of the paper. So, and maybe I will turn, since also we're also running out of time, I turn over to Mark.
Thank you, Dr. Escresa. Again, it's such a delight always having you as our moderator here at the Energy Policy Series. And I think in the next couple of months, we'll also see Dr. Escresa again present another paper from her. So that would be very, very exciting. And we look forward to seeing you again. And also join me in thanking our panelists, Dr. Abrigo, Ms. Ortiz, and Dr. Handok for their astute insights and perspectives. And I think our Adrian, our research assistant, would be taking a photo for the panelists. So I'd like to request everybody, including Ms. Ortiz, to please turn on their camera. The obligatory Zoom photo.
So we'll take a picture in 3, 2, 1. Another one. 3, 2, 1. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. And also thank you to all our participants for their engagement throughout the webinar. We apologize for all those questions that are left unanswered due to our very limited time. But again, we appreciate your participation, and that concludes the 5th installment of the Energy Policy Series. As mentioned, please stay tuned for the succeeding EPS in the coming months. We have such a wealth of upcoming working papers in the pipeline. Again, you may access the working paper of Dr. Abrigo and Ms. Ortiz through the link provided in the chat box. And also, please don't forget to fill in our post-event survey form. We would be very delighted to hear your thoughts and feedback from today's webinar. And the Energy Policy Series is presented by ASAP Cells, supported by the European Union, and implemented by the Ateneo School of Government. Please visit our website at asapcells.com and like ASOG's Facebook page for all updates on our next Energy Policy Series and research publications. Enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.